It's okay. We're live? Okay, fantastic. Welcome everyone to our Africa Fashion Week London Masterclass series. Today we have the wonderful and beautiful Abisade Adenubi, who is an international lawyer, an industrialist, and also an academic. And she's had 15 years of professional work profile. Abisade is also the founder and executive director of Heritage Apparels, which is a textile and apparel production factory in Ogun State, Nigeria. So we're really happy to have you here, Abisade. Abisade will be covering a masterclass series today on the business of fashion. So Abisade, how are you? Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So the floor is yours to discuss with our audience about the business of fashion. How today will happen. Abisade will go through her lesson for approximately 40 to 45 minutes. If you have any questions, please ask in the panel, and we will go through the live Q&A after a session. You can also ask us any questions on our Facebook Live as well. And after a session, we'll go through the questions. So thank you very much for joining us. Over to you, Abisade.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Buki. Cool. So good afternoon to everyone. Well, maybe not afternoon, depending on where you're joining in from, but good day to everyone. I hope you're well. Yes, so as Buki said, my name is Abisade Adenubi. I'm not going to go through what she has said, but I'm just going to add a little bit more in terms of my profile, not just, not to brag, but just to give you a little bit of a sense as to what my background is, just so that that could help in terms of any questions that you think I might be able to answer based on the experience that I've had. So I'm a lawyer by training. I trained and qualified as a lawyer in England about 11 years ago now. And I worked in corporate London. So basically worked in corporate law firms and financial institutions as legal counsel for about 10 years. One of the questions that I often get is how I ended up in fashion. Like, how does a lawyer end up, end up doing a fashion business? And, what happened was I had set up, just as a hobby, I had set up a fashion business with a friend of mine who was a fashion designer when I lived in London. And it sort of, began to grow. And we were doing production in Thailand, we did production in India and in the UK as well. And like I said, it wasn't necessarily supposed to be a business per se. It just kind of got born out of a hobby. And that's why I'm really passionate about this topic around the business of fashion, because I find that a lot of times many creatives, many fashion entrepreneurs kind of start a business purely based out of passion. They have a keen interest, they've gone to fashion school or whatever, and they sort of want to set up a business. But there are a lot of other kind of infrastructural issues or infrastructural aspects that have not really been given that much thought to. So that's what we're going to be covering today. So back to the story. So basically did that. And then there came a point where I began to think, well, why do I have to go all the way to Bangkok, which is a 13-hour flight from London to be able to do production? So I began to think around alternatives in terms of where to do production. And that's kind of what led me into what I'm doing now, which is basically a garment factory that we have. So we basically do production for mass production essentially, and we also do production for designers who want to go or scale up into retail manufacturing but don't have the in-house capacity to do so. So that's kind of that. I have a few more sort of preamble things to cover, but whilst I'm doing that, it would be really great, because I know that we have people from all over the place and from sort of different areas. So it'd be really great if you could just put in the chat box just very quickly where in the world you're joining us from. Can't assume everyone is either in Africa or in London. So where in the world you're joining us from, and also what kind of business you actually do or want to do. So for those who actually haven't started running a business yet, what kind of business are you actually seeking to do? London, okay. Yeah, so that would be great. So just be doing that whilst I'm sort of going through a couple of other things. So like I said very briefly earlier, the impetus, and if I'm speaking too quickly, let me know. I'm just trying to cover as much as possible. So yeah, so the one of the sort of strong impetus for this session today is to basically teach, or begin to teach creatives and fashion designers and fashion entrepreneurs the non-creative aspects of running a fashion business. So for the most part, creatives sort of tend to focus on the creative aspects. You design, and that's kind of what you do. But the other kind of business aspects are not given as much attention. And those are the areas that I would like to cover today, because the truth of the matter is, if you don't have a strong business or a strong business model or a strong business core, no matter how how creative you are, you'll struggle in the long run. You might be okay when you're just doing like single pieces for people, but when you really want to start operating as a business, you would want to have those things in place. And so the things that I'm going to be covering today, I like to refer to them as the foundational infrastructure of a fashion business. So if you think about your fashion business as a house, for example, that you're building over a period of time. So you're building, but the only thing that would actually make that business solid or make it stand or make it sort of, withstand any external or even internal pressures is the structure, is the foundation. And so what I'm going to be covering today is essentially those foundational issues that you want to be alive to as you're running your business, right? I hope all that's clear. Okay, so I'm seeing things here from the UK, from London, from Nigeria. Okay, great. Vintage retail store, fashion designing, excellent. So that is all very cool. So now my approach for today is going to be to cover quite a breadth, as opposed to going sort of deep into issues, because from the kind of comments and questions that I get from fashion entrepreneurs, I see that sometimes one of the key things is actually just having some kind of framework upon which to hang your knowledge, your understanding when it comes to the business aspects of your business, if that makes sense. So I'm going to be covering the legal side of your fashion business, right? So there are also different legal issues that one should really consider and one should really pay keen attention to. There are a number of things that I'll run through. And then the second aspect is really around the operational side of your business. So number one, legal issues. Number two, operational aspects. Now, there are other aspects of running a business that I'm not, that we just wouldn't have the time, to sort of go into. And, quite frankly, I'm probably not best placed to talk about things like finance, for your business. But just to give an example, or to give a kind of, overview of what those other things are. So things like, like the finance aspect of your business. How are you raising capital to start your business? How are you spending money in your business? How are you keeping record or keeping track of income, of expenses, all of that stuff under finances? And then sales and marketing as well is also a really key area. How are people hearing about you? How are you putting the word out there about your business? How are you marketing yourself? How are you going about customer acquisition? So basically, how are you getting new customers? How are you keeping the customers that you have? All of that stuff I'm not sort of going to delve into, but it's just good to be aware in terms of the kind of different strands of sort of the business of fashion that you want to keep top of mind. So before we delve into, so I'm going to start off with the legal side and then go on to operational aspects as well. And just so you know, if I see any questions, so as I go along, if you have any questions or comments, just put them in the comment box, and generally we'll leave those until the end. But as I'm going through, if I see any question pop up that directly relates to a point that I'm making or a particular issue, I'll just address it quickly, just so it's really topical and top of mind. So before I even begin to delve into the legal side and the operations, I like to look at first principles. First principles, so in that sense, I mean, even before you begin to build all of this infrastructure, before you begin to consider, okay, what are the legal issues? What are the operational issues? What are the kind of financial aspects of my business, I think that it's really, really key to spend some time thinking about first principles. What do I mean by that? So basically the what, the how, and the why. What are you actually producing? What are you actually making? So sometimes, you know these things, you have a sort of head knowledge of these things, so you can quickly reel off, what you're doing. But in terms of articulating clearly, and I'm going on about this because it really speaks to everything that you begin to do as a business. So, and I'll give you an example using my own personal business, just to kind of show the importance of, from the get-go, really identifying, understanding clearly what it is that you're producing, right? So, it might sound cliche, or, what is your vision? What is your mission statement? All of that, but it's so important because understanding those things about yourself, about your business from the outset really helps you to know sort of how you want to build, what kinds of things that you will do and not do. Does that make sense? So for example, with my business, what am I doing? The business has four sort of distinct aspects. One is, like I said before, we do mass production. Number two, we do retail manufacturing for fashion designers. Number three, we also do textile production as well. My factory is based in Abeokuta in Nigeria, which is the cultural home of Adire fabric. So we do Adire production as well. And finally, we have a vocational institute where we're training people in terms of garment construction and so on. So that's my what. That's what I'm doing. It's clear, it's concise. I know what I'm doing. I can tell anyone, I can explain to anyone quite quickly what it is that we're doing. That's one. Now, who am I servicing, right? So who are my potential clients? For me, it's mostly corporates because, like for the mass production aspect, it's corporates because we're producing things like uniforms for schools, uniforms for security businesses, uniforms for, industrial businesses that need, say, overalls and coveralls and so on, right? And also fashion designers as well. So that's who I'm servicing. And the why, what is the why? Why am I even here? Why did I even set up the business in the first place? And the why for that, as I mentioned again earlier, was I had started off doing production for my previous fashion business abroad. So I did production in different countries. And so one of the strong whys for me is to show, to prove to myself, to my staff, to Nigerians, and to people globally that we actually can produce high quality apparel in Nigeria, in Africa. That's one of the whys. Another why is to also, sort of contribute to capacity building initiatives within the industry in Nigeria. So hence the training. And also another why for me is creating employment. So at the moment we employ 40 people here. So I'm not saying all of that to talk about myself. It's just to give an example of just really breaking things down and understanding what it is that you're doing, who you're servicing, and why you do what you do. Because as we'll go on to see, having a clear understanding of these first principles really, excuse me, really goes a long Okay.
Abisade, are you okay?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you. So we'll begin from where you started from, okay? I'm unmuting myself.
All right. Okay, hello. I'm back, everyone. Sorry about that. So I'm like I said, I'm in Nigeria and I'm back with and it's raining heavily here, so maybe that affected. Anyway, I'm back now. Great. So what I was saying was just sort of wrapping up, like the first principles, talking about how these first principles really begin to inform all the things that you take into account, what you would do in your business, and so on. Right. Okay. So let me just check. Nothing so far. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So I was saying just before I went off, can you just give me a thumbs up or, raise your hands if you kind of follow all that I've said so far. You can hear me. Awesome. Good stuff. Okay. So yes, all good. Thank you, Lola. Right. So let's start looking at the legal aspects. I'm going to cover about like four quick issues. And like I said earlier, I've chosen to go for breadth rather than depth so that you sort of have some kind of framework upon which you can begin to build your knowledge. So the first thing for me, from a legal perspective, again, I don't know like what sort of level each person is at from a sort of business startup perspective. If you're just starting up, if you are already established, but in any event, it's still kind of important to mention this because even for some established businesses who've been running for years, they still don't have a proper or properly identified corporate business structure. So the very first thing for me from a legal perspective is what sort of structure are you going to operate under as a business? Are you going to be a solopreneur, so just by yourself, a sole person? Are you going to work as a partnership with somebody else, which I have done before? Or are you going to operate as like a company, as a sort of set up limited liability company? What basis are you going to operate? And there are sort of pros and cons of each of these, but it's really important to begin to think around that. So for example, if you're going to be operating as a partnership or as a company, you really want to begin to document the basis on which you're going to do business, because there are other people involved. So you really want to understand, and you hear this all the time when people go into a partnership. Two friends want to set up a business of some sort. They're excited. There's a lot of passion in the room, and they just kind of set up. There's been no discussion, or even if there has been discussion, no documentation around things like how decisions will be made. So say there's me and Lola that are in a business together. If I have a great idea and Lola does not agree, do we go on to take up that idea as a business or not? Or if they're even like more than two people, if they're three people, do we have to have unanimity? Do we have to have unanimous decision making before we go on with an idea? How are we going to make and spend money? How are we going to raise money? Some people have different sort of risk appetite levels. How are we going to raise money? Do we want to go for equity? Do we want to go for debt? Do we want to go with friends and family? Are we going to put our own money in? If we're going to put our own money in, how much is each person bringing? What are the percentages? Those sorts of things you really want to kind of discuss early on and not only discuss but document as well. I'm going to be harping on about documentation throughout the course because that is one of the foundational aspects of setting aside a business from a hobby, right? So you really want to put things in writing. You want to have proper processes and proper documents for things. So you want to talk about, so how will money be shared? Right? So if you're all putting money in equally, presumably you'll all be sort of taking money out of the business by way of profits or by way of dividends if you're shareholders in the business. But that also needs to be covered as well. How are you going to deal with conflict and disagreements? If you guys don't agree on particular things, how are you going to deal with that? And how are you going to deal with exit as well? If somebody wants to leave the business and say two other parties remain, how will you manage that? So these are all the kinds of issues that you want to really document in some sort of, shareholders agreement if you're shareholders, or you want to document by way of a partnership agreement if you're partners. Yeah, so I hope that's clear. So in summary, for that first part of the legal aspect is your corporate business structure. What are you doing in that regard, right? Do you actually understand what the pros and cons of each of these methods that I've, or structures that I've talked about are? So if you're by yourself, you must know that you're the one who's going to do everything. You're going to pay for everything. If you're in a sort of partnership or company structure, of course, the obligations will be shared, but the rights will also be shared as well. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two is customer contracts, and this is where one of the areas where a lot of issues potentially sort of abound a lot. A lot of issues around non-payment of fees after a fashion designer or other creative has done work. Creatives often, or like designers often find themselves in positions where there's no agreement in writing about what work you've agreed to do. So for example, a customer comes to you, they really want to produce something quickly, time is of the essence, that you don't have that much time, everyone's sort of rushing around just to try and get the job started, and then you realize that you haven't even clearly agreed a number of key things. Number one, what are you actually even producing, right? So let's take a fashion designer, for example. Somebody comes to you, oh, I want to make 10 pieces of this design. Here's a picture of the design. They don't bring a tech pack, for example, so you actually don't know. So you can see basically in really, really basic terms what the design is and what it looks like, or you haven't gone layers beneath to actually understand what sort of construction the client wants. So what kind of zip do they want to use? What color of zip do they want to use? What, all of those sorts of things, thread, what color of thread, all of those different things that you would want to have in a tech pack. If you're rushing things through, there's no clear agreement as to even what exactly you're producing. So you would now then finish production, and then the customer is like, ah, this is actually not what I wanted. I wanted this to be here. I wanted this to be that shade of red or whatever. And then you now then, sort of come into, big problems, right? Where even, getting your balance or even getting any of your money becomes a problem. So that you really want to sort of, clearly define and clearly state what you're doing, what you're not doing. Number two, so what are you producing? What are the component parts? You want to have a tech pack to deal with all of those different things. What is the delivery date? I've actually been in a situation years ago where I was producing something for a customer, and there was no indication. So we'd agreed an end delivery date, or this thing needs to be delivered in 3 weeks, right? And then like 2 weeks into the order, they started calling me to ask, oh, can you start delivering these items in batches? But we never discussed batches. Do you know what I mean? So you really want to understand what the delivery date is. Are you going to be delivering in batches, or are you going to be delivering all in one at the end? Who is arranging delivery? Are you as the designer going to be delivering? Is the client going to arrange collection? Clarify who is doing that, regardless of who is doing it. So who is paying for delivery? So if you as a designer is actually going to be delivering to the client, are you paying for delivery? Have you included delivery costs in your costing? Is that all clear for everyone to know? And I think one thing to really bear in mind as well is, the point at which the risk passes. So if you're taking on delivery, know that, once the items leave your store or your studio or whatever, they're still in your care, and the risk still lies with you until they get delivered to the customer. Whereas if the customer comes to collect, it's the other way around, where basically, they have, they sort of take on the risk for the delivery of those items once they pick up from you. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, so I really wanted to sort of talk about this customer contracts one, because it's so important. This is one area, because at the end of the day, when you've done work for a customer, you want to get paid. But if you don't take into account all of these different issues, getting paid is at risk, essentially. So they might seem like small issues that you can overlook, but they can cause significant problems. So imagine, for example, you do work for a client that's worth like millions of naira or tens of thousands of pounds or whatever, and you never get paid that money because you didn't state clearly what you were producing, all of that, when they were going to be delivered. And, so the expectations were not clearly defined. You could actually go out of business depending on, on sort of how much impact that amount of money has on you and your business. So it's really important. So that's that for customer contracts. I'll just talk very, very briefly about supplier contracts as well, because I know, or I get the sense that a lot of the people who are joining are quite sort of, small fashion brands and small fashion designers. And so this might not necessarily be as much of an issue at this stage, but it's still something to bear in mind, because I know that as a sort of small and growing fashion brand, you're probably just going to the market, buying fabric from one person that you know, or whatever. But as you begin to grow, like, you really want to have clear understandings with your suppliers, right? And I think one of the things that COVID has really exposed is the fact that, and I'll talk about this in a bit more depth later on when I talk about operations and supply chain issues, is that a lot of people actually really don't have a good solid handle on their supplier sort of chain, or like their supply chain or their supplier network. So you know the one person that you buy fabric from, but you don't know where they get fabric from. Do you know what I mean? And so it's really, it's really critical to begin to understand and to begin to really talk about entering into agreements with people that supply you as well. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about, so point number 4 under legal issues is basically intellectual property. So this is one area that I think causes a lot of confusion amongst fashion designers. And whilst I'm not seeking to turn you guys into intellectual property lawyers or experts today, I think it's still really, really useful to know, to have some basic understanding of what you can and cannot do from an intellectual property standpoint for your business. So I'll just run through very quickly and just point out as I go along how each of these intellectual property types pertain to fashion businesses. So intellectual property is basically property that is not physical, right? So things that you have created can be protected by intellectual property. And there's a sort of, international intellectual property regime, and then also national intellectual property regimes. What that means is you can protect your designs or your trademarks or whatever from a kind of, global perspective, or from a country perspective, or from a regional perspective. So for example, do I want to protect something in Nigeria where I'm based, or I want to protect, so which means that only people in Nigeria would be kind of covered by the intellectual property regime restrictions. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a bit more depth. So number one, and what, like why this is important for me is sometimes you hear designers talking about how they want to get a patent on the design, or they want to, get a trademark on this design, which you actually cannot do. So number one is copyright. Copyright doesn't apply so much to designers, but I'll explain like the sort of, so the angle from which you can get, you can potentially get the copyright protection as a fashion designer. So copyright, generally speaking, protects works of authorship. So things that have been written, images, for example, drawings. So things like, books are protected by copyright, and not really any other design right, except maybe, trademarks, but I won't go, that's quite detailed. I won't go into that. So generally speaking, things like books, things like song lyrics, things like drawings, which is now where it begins to become relevant to fashion designers, drawings, sketches, illustrations, right? So from a copyright perspective, as a designer, if you're looking to protect anything using copyright as an intellectual property protection, what you're generally speaking looking at are your illustrations, your sketches. And what that basically means is that once you have that protection, and copyright tends to attach automatically, which means that you generally speaking don't have to go and register a copyright in any copyright agency or whatever. Just the mere fact that you've produced something, copyright basically attaches to it. There's some nuances to that, but that's the basic kind of operation. And what that then sort of means is if you're not the copyright holder, you cannot use those items that are protected by copyright without the owner's permission. So for example, in a book, you can't just reproduce a book without getting the author's permission. In the case of fashion designs, you can't just sort of use someone's illustrations or sketches. Now, where it gets a little bit technical is the fact that with copyright, so using illustrations and sketches, with copyright, what you're protecting is the sketch itself, not the design. I hope that makes sense. It's the sketch itself. Someone can't just use that sketch and say that it's theirs. We now go into a different category of design rights when you start looking at the actual design that is kind of that is covered in that sketch or that is depicted in that sketch. I hope that makes sense. So I'll move on very quickly. Next is trademarks. So trademarks usually is used to protect brands, right? Coca-Cola, Apple, these are all trademarks. You can't just stand up and go and use Apple's logo on a business. And what trademarks are, usually used to do is to distinguish brands, right? And so you can't, use another brand's, especially if you're working in this, within the same sort of context or area. So now for fashion designers or for fashion businesses, what that means is if you're thinking about intellectual property protection as part of your kind of business arsenal, from a trademark perspective, what you're looking at is your brand. So your brand name, your brand sort of logo or typeface or whatever. So it's it's those sorts of things that can be used to distinguish between your brand and a different brand that are protected by trademarks. You cannot trademark a design, right? So that's that. Patents now are even sort of even more far removed from a sort of fashion designer, fashion business perspective, because patents speak to inventions, and so for a patent to be protected, or rather for something to be protected via patents, it has to be new, so something that that has not existed before. It has to be useful, and it has to be not obvious. So this sort of tends to apply mostly to industrial stuff. So you're creating something, or maybe like a chemical mix. So for example, to kind of bring it back, to bring it home. So if you're like a textile designer, for example, and you mix some chemicals to come up with a really, really unique shade of color that we've not seen before, then you can patent that, because what you'll be doing is basically creating something new, something that did not exist before. So you've invented something basically, or like a telephone, right? So when I think it was Alexander Graham Bell, I think who sort of developed or created the telephone from the beginning, or for the first time, that will be an invention because he's invented something new. Does that make sense? So for fashion designers, you're not necessarily inventing anything new that is useful and that is not obvious. In your mind, you might be inventing, new designs or whatever, or you can protect that under other things, not under patents. The one thing, so as as the world begins to evolve or continues to evolve, and we're kind of moving into a more digitized world, and you're hearing things like wearable technology. So people are creating like amazing things using fabric that kind of responds. I was in a conference once and they were talking about some kind of like jackets, I think, or like outerwear that people at an event could wear that would change color depending on what team or group or whatever they were in. If you're creating something like that as a fashion designer, then you're kind of now veering into the field of invention, because you're inventing something that didn't exist before. But for your regular designs and patents don't really apply. And then you have trade secrets, which are even more far removed. Things like recipes, formulas don't really, again, unless you're sort of creating something like that as part of your business, you're not sort of really in the trade secrets sphere. And then you have design rights. So design rights are kind of the most hotly contested aspect, or intellectual property rights. And that's because it's kind of like a catch-all for a lot of design stuff, and there's an ongoing debate in different jurisdictions, different countries have taken different positions in terms of whether fashion designs can be protected as design rights or not. But the kinds of things that are kind of mostly globally accepted to be protected as part of design rights are things like packaging, product shapes. So for example, Lego is a great example. So that's like a design right, because it's a distinctive design that the makers of Lego, have a design right over. You can't just go and start producing Lego bricks because because that design right, belongs to Lego. So, okay, that's kind of that for legal stuff that I wanted to talk about. So I've talked about corporate structure, I've talked about customer contracts, I've talked about supplier contracts very briefly, and then intellectual property issues as well. Yeah, I hope that's all clear. So I'm just going to move on very quickly now to the operational side of your business, as sort of running a fashion business, and this is really, really critical. I often say that for fashion businesses, especially manufacturing like mine, process is so, actually in any business, process is so important. And it's so easy to kind of overlook certain things because they don't seem significant. But a combination or accumulation of many, many small things that are not working as well as they should, or that are wasteful, for example, cause big problems in the end. So I'll give you a classic example. So like in my business, we operate like a sort of production line system, whereby if we're making a shirt, for example, one person doesn't just sort of sit down and make the whole shirt. One person will make the shoulder, will kind of attach the shoulder seams. One person will fix the collar. One person will fix the cuff, and so on and so forth. So imagine at the very outset of the of this chain, the person who's fixing the collar doesn't fix the collar right. It might seem like a really, really small mistake, but what now then happens is by the time we've now produced 100 shirts, because of that small problem in the collar at the beginning of the chain, we have to rip and do everything all over again. Does that make sense? So the point I'm trying to make is that process is so important, and getting every sort of step, getting the process right every step of the way is so crucial to be able to deliver things on time and to deliver things to a very high standard. So the kind of three areas that I'm going to talk about under the operational aspects. The first is business processes, structures, and systems. There has to be a system for everything. Like, I'm of the opinion that even just living and breathing, you have to have a system, and we most times do, but we actually just, don't really realize there's some kind of system at work in terms of how we do things, but really becoming aware of that system and being intentional and deliberate about creating a system and a process. So for example, what is the process from when the customer gets in touch with you, either on Instagram, on Facebook, or calls you as the business owner, to when they get their finished product? You really want to break down all of those different steps from an internal perspective and from an external perspective, right? So when a client comes to you, I want to make 10 dresses in this size, in this design, whatever, in these colors, whatever, and that's all kind of sorted. What then happens? So they send you a message on Instagram, a DM, or whatever. Then what's the next process, right? So maybe somebody in your team or you as the business owner send an email to clarify what your understanding is. You should have a template for that email so that you're not doing the same thing. Somebody else contacts you next week, then you start a whole email chain from scratch. So you kind of want to start creating standard templates, standard processes, standard systems for doing things. Oh, by the way, one point that I should have mentioned when I was talking about customer contracts is one of the ways to really protect yourself from the risk of not having a contract is to have a contract ready. So have a template. So when I say contract, it doesn't have to be, when I worked as a lawyer, I would often work with 300-page legal documents. It doesn't have to be that. It can just be a one-pager, because all you're trying to do is just to set straight everybody's expectations, rights, obligations, who's doing what, when, what do you expect, what am I delivering, and so on. So nothing complicated, but just have that document already ready so that when a new customer comes, all you have to do is just change the name and change the specific terms, price, delivery date, whatever. Because I find that if you don't have that document to hand, then it becomes a time-consuming exercise for you to even think about it, because you're in the thick of it. You're trying to start production ASAP, right? The last thing on your mind is to now start sitting down, drafting a document, or contacting a lawyer or whatever. So what you want to do is really, really have that document, or those whatever documents they are to hand, have them ready. So one of the back end things that you want to do in advance, and this whole COVID downtime, is, you know, it's quite a good time to do that. I've been doing a lot of that kind of stuff, a lot of operational stuff, just making sure that we're operating as efficiently as we could, and we have all of these different things in place. So yeah, so that was just jumping back quickly to customer contracts. So now back to you know, your processes, your systems, your structures. So somebody gets in touch with you, what's the next step? So what then happens, right? Are you the one who deals with them? Do you pass it on to your assistant or to somebody else to kind of, you know, follow up with the customer? Once you've now then kind of finalized what they want to do, then what's the next step? Do you get them to create a tech pack, really clearly identifying all what they want, including swatches for the designs, swatches for the fabric, samples of the trimmings, whatever? Is that what you do? And then what? And you know, before that, do you, you know, like, how do you actually communicate your process to the potential client? Do you tell them, here's how much we charge, here's our price list, whatever? All of those different things kind of have to be clearly identified. Once you've done the sample, then what happens? Does the customer then have to approve? Do you have an approval document, just so it's really clear that the customer actually approved this, right? Do you, you know, like, what do you do next? Once you've done that, do you then sort of go into production? Like, you know, who is responsible for that? So you want to do that from a sort of external perspective and from an internal perspective as well. So externally, you want to set out all these things in terms of what the customer's experience and interaction with your business will be every step of the way. So break it down into really, really, really small units. So we do this, and it sounds really tedious, but trust me, once you've done this once you put in the work, it just makes life so much easier for you as you begin to grow and to build your business. So break down all the steps. So we do, so step 1 is this, step 2 is that, step 3 is that, step 4 is that, all the way. And then you can kind of then begin to see where the potential, you know, issues or risks and how you can go about mitigating them. Just looking at the time, okay, and how you can go about mitigating them. So for example, one of the things that I noticed in my business that was kind of a little bit of a glitch was when we do work for designers, we ask designers to bring their own fabric for various reasons, which I won't go into. But because we're based in Abeokuta, there was always this issue of, oh, we have to find someone who's coming to Abeokuta or who is going to Lagos. How are we going to get the fabric to you and all of that? So what I did was just, you know, agreed with a hub in Lagos that, okay, let's just take up some space in your co-working space or in your hub, and then we can now then get designers who are in Lagos, at least for now, to drop fabric there for us to pick up on a particular date, and then we would also drop finished garments for our clients there as well. And then, you know, there's a whole sort of documentation process, how we confirm who left what on what dates, who signed for it, all of that kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean? But if you don't break up all the different processes involved, then you don't really know where there are bottlenecks, where there's waste, where there's overburden, for example, and so on. So you do that from an external perspective, and then internally as well. So when you get an order, then what? You have to buy materials. Are you going to buy materials in bulk and keep? Probably not. As a small business, you kind of buy to order. Do you have sufficient interaction with your supplier to know that this particular fabric will be available, in what quantities, all of that? So what do you begin to do internally? The source fabric, who's responsible for doing that, right? So once they get it, who's checking the fabric to make sure that it's the right amount, it's the right shade, it's the right color, whatever. Do you have enough threads? Do you have enough? All of these different things. Again, it might seem like really, really small, but imagine you don't have enough thread, you don't have enough this, whatever, and then you've agreed the delivery dates for, today's Monday, for Friday, the 4th of June. Is that it? I think so. Friday, the 4th of June. And then you start running around because you run out of thread. And then you start, you know, it causes delay, all of these different things. So you really want to avoid all of those things by just breaking down what your external process is from a client-facing perspective, but also what your internal processes are, and really identify who is responsible for what. And just kind of work your way through that from the end, like, you know, from one end to the other, from when you get the order to when you deliver the order. I hope that makes sense. So that's kind of, you know, the high level points for business processes and structures. In terms of systems as well, again, a lot of times small businesses think, oh, you know, we're only small, we don't really need to do all this, you know, all these plenty things, all of that. But again, which is why I started off from the first principles. What do you see your business becoming, right? And begin to act in accordance with what you see. Act in accordance with your vision. So if you're trying to create a world-renowned company or you're still small today, start putting in place things that will get you to that world-renowned company over the course of however long the period is, 2 years, whatever that's in your business plan. Do you know what I mean? So, for example, things like money. A lot of businesses, they will start up business. I've done this before in my very, very first business where, basically spending money. So I was paying for the business from my personal accounts, business money, my money. It was all sort of commingled. And yeah, no, not good. Do you know what I mean? So you want to create systems. So how am I documenting my financial inflow and outflow? What are my procurement processes? And for many of these things, like I said, they just sound grandiose sometimes, but really it's actually, using the, one page, for example, what is our, procedure or policy on XYZ topic, right? So for us as a business here, we have to have a small policy around petty cash, because people are coming to me every day, oh, madam, we need to buy, I don't know, whatever, soap, whatever, like, random little things. There has to be, I don't want to be getting contacted to buy soap and to buy whatever in the factory. Do you know what I mean? So there has to be, a small procedure around that. So when we need XYZ, who does it? Where does the money come from? Petty cash, who is responsible for that? How does that get accounted for? And so on. So again, they might seem like small things, but when you do all of these small things, it just adds up to a really, really well-run business that is just not a mom and pop shop, but is actually sustainable as a business. Okay, I'm going to move on from that. So key takeaway from that is have your processes, think about your business from an end-to-end perspective, internally and externally. Break down and identify all the different steps and processes that are involved from one end to the other, and think around how you want to make those things happen, who the people are that are involved, and and just kind of how the whole process would work. And then you can begin to see potential issues and deal with those issues before they kill your business, essentially. So that's that. Number two, supply chain issues. Now, COVID has really, really exposed the fact that, as an industry, we've been so heavily reliant on one country, one region for basically, raw materials, intermediates, component parts, different things. And so we're now beginning to see that, many people didn't actually have as clear a handle on their supply chain as they probably thought that they did, right? So you, like I said earlier, you buy fabric from one person, but you have no idea how, China relates to this person that you're buying fabric from. So really, really wanting to start getting a clear handle on, on what your supply chain looks like, where you're getting not just fabric, but where you're getting all your other materials from. So for example, if you're a designer and you have an embroiderer who probably is employed on a freelance basis, you kind of want to, they're part of your supply chain, right? Can you reach them when you need to reach them for work, So those sorts of things, just really, just really clarifying and documenting what it is that your supply chain looks like and any potential issues to be resolved. And the final thing I'm going to talk about is under operations is human capital. So people. So we're primarily a people business until, until we become so heavily digitized where we now have robots that are sewing things for us, that are spitting garments out. We're still very much, we're still very much heavily reliant on people, on human capital to do our business as fashion entrepreneurs. And so what are you doing around people, right? So you might think, oh, you only employ one person, but it's so important to really document and clarify, because what I found that causes a lot of problems is, and in fact, this actually happened to me at some point where you hire somebody on the basis of their skills, of their experience, of their expertise, and it's great. They can actually do all of the things, or most of the things that that you want them to do, but you haven't actually clarified to them what your expectations are of them, right? Because you just assume, well, they've told me that that they do X, Y, Z. Yeah, let them just crack on doing that. And then you then have some kind of mismatch between what their understanding of what you expect from them is and what you actually expect from them. And because a lot of these things are kind of unspoken, right, everybody starts to get frustrated and irritated because they're not delivering what you want, but in their minds they think that they are, right? But because you've not been clear as an employer in terms of what you want from them, what you expect of them, what you do not expect of them, you know, all of those kind of different things, like how you're going to, well, I guess usually would, you know, would kind of talk about basic pay, but, you know, are there any incentives? Are you going to incentivize them? If they do, you know, if they hit their targets or if they surpass their targets, do they get compensated for that, or do they get an incentive for that, and so on? And so with me, for example, who is running a business where there are 40 staff, it's so critical for me to, you know, kind of let everybody know very, very, very clearly by way of a job description what your job is, right? So that when you come here in the morning, you don't just sit around waiting for instructions to be given to you. You already know in advance what your job is. And that begins to eliminate wasted time. That begins to cut back on inefficiencies and all of that, because you're not just sort of, you know, sitting down there waiting for the owner of the business to come and tell you what to do. You already know what you're supposed to be doing because you have. And I'll even go one step further beyond just a job description, even just a checklist, a daily checklist. So when you come into the factory, for example, for me, clean your machine down first, you know, next thing, check, you know, do you understand? So just basically clarify things, because I find that the more granular you get in terms of describing what you expect of people, the more what they produce begins to look like what you want out of them. So that's kind of one in terms of clarifying expectations, but also what kind of work environment do you want to create, right? That's also a crucial part of the business. How do you want your employees to feel? How do you want them to kind of, you know, carry on? So for me, for example, one of the key things for me, excuse me, is the fact that I want my people to feel respected. I want them to feel like they've been treated with dignity. And that's a key thread that runs across all that I do from a business perspective, because for me, my people are very, very crucial. If I'm here and I have an order to produce maybe 1,000 pieces of something, which we actually do at the moment, and people don't turn up, I'm not going to sit down and sew 1,000 pieces of, you know, of scrubs or whatever by myself. So for me, the way that I treat my people is actually, you know, quite a core part of how, you know, of my business strategy. And one of the questions that I get asked all the time is, you know, how do you get your people to stay? Because I trained all my staff from scratch. Like, you know, when I started the business, I spent the first 6 months, no work, we just trained. I got trainers to come from Sri Lanka to train them. And so people are always like, oh my God, you've invested so much money and so much in these staff. How do you guard against them leaving? So one, there are legal ways of doing that. But at the end of the day, like, you're not going to be running after Abeokuta tailors that you've trained to sue them, or, you know, what are you going to do? So I think that yes, you protect yourself legally, but at the same time, you also create an environment where people actually can leave if they want, but they choose not to leave because they actually like and enjoying working in your organization. So that's also a key kind of, you know, business strategy as well that one can use from a human capital perspective. So I have talked for 53 minutes and I've covered all that I wanted to cover. I will shut up now and just ask for any questions, any comments. I hope that has been useful. I hope it's been clear. Talk to me in the comments. Thank you. Buki.
Yeah, hi. Abisade, that was really, really great. Thank you so much. I personally, I've learned so much this afternoon, especially on the importance of structuring the business, the idea, and the legal impact it could have, as also, and the legal planning to take when protecting, you know, pattern, brands, everything you mentioned so much. And I hope the audience have been able to learn as much as I have. We have a number of questions for you. I hope we're able to answer them all. I think in total we have about 6 or 7. So without further ado, I will ask you the first one, which came through earlier on. It's about your production company. And the question was, does your production company take small orders, as most designers cannot afford mass orders? And what's your minimum order? And that comes from Ronke.
Okay, so the short answer is yes, we do small orders. And the reason for that is, like I said, the whole ethos of starting this business in the first place was born out of my own problem running I'm not a designer, running a fashion business. And so I really have a keen desire to help designers start up. So we do production anywhere from like 10 pieces per design, which is actually really small for now. So yes, so we do small orders for sure.
So I have a question from Jennifer Roan. I think I've said the last, and I hope I've said it right. She says, one automatically thinks that factories have poor working conditions in Africa and put the responsibility on the designers to ensure living wage and good working conditions in factories. What has Heritage Apparel in place to support us?
Sorry, can you say that again from the beginning?
So she's saying basically, hello?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, so she's asking, obviously with the factories being known to have poor working conditions in Africa, and with a lot of the responsibilities being put on the designers to make sure that the living wage is, you know, taken care of. And she wants to know, with regards to your organization, Heritage Apparel, what do you have in place to support the living wage and the responsibility and so forth?
Sure. Okay. So one of the things that I'm super passionate about, and I actually suspect I'm going to become an advocate of very, very soon, is working and living condition. Well, maybe not living, because I don't house my people. You know, I house them when we're doing specific projects. But so yeah, working conditions basically is number one. People have to be paid a fair wage. One. Two, people have to be incentivized for the work that they do. So if we have a target of 10 and you do 12, I want to incentivize you for that. I want to appreciate you for doing that, right? Also, there are also other things, other measures that I have in place in my head and in my plan to institute, and I'll explain. So I lived in Europe for almost 20 years before I moved back to Nigeria about 18 months ago. And from all of my experiences in terms of, work the corporate life for the most part, and I was bringing that sort of mindset to my company, which is great. But what that also meant was I had all these ideas of things that I wanted to do. I want my people to have a pension. I want people to have health insurance, all of these different things, which I still will do. But what I realized is you have to pace these things, because the work ethic point, just like true speak, the work ethic is different in this part of the world, is what I've seen. It's different. And so I think that if you bombard people with all of these incentives, all of these things in one go, you can run into problems from doing that as well, because you can be taken advantage of, all of that. So what I would say, what I am doing is I have a clear plan of where I want to end up, where you have to implement and execute from a strategic perspective as well. So I hope that that answers your question. So I think it's really important to have these things in place, or be strategic about how you actually implement them, because you also want to protect yourself as a business. You're not there to kind of just be throwing money away. So you want to do the right thing from a business perspective, but you also sort of want to just strike a balance between business continuity and human capital issues. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that really does make sense. It's all about the balance between, like you just said, human capital and making sure that everything goes well. So I've got another question here. Can you advise on markup of prices? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Can you advise on markup of prices, as some designers feel that because they make an outfit that looks like an Armani outfit, they can sell at Armani prices?
Right.
Yes.
So markup of prices, there's so many different kind of methods and calculations and formulas for doing markup. Some people say that you add 50% or whatever of what your costs are. Some say that so for like a manufacturing business like ours, you kind of work out what your cost per second or per minute or whatever is, and then include your overheads. There's so many different methods which I won't go into. The bottom line is, in business generally, and especially in the creative business, you charge what your clients are willing to pay for. That's just pretty much what it is. So pricing is a key part of your own business strategy, right? There's no kind of right or wrong way to price. So you can do research on all the different sort of formulas, all the different sort of calculations, how where it's like, where should you put your overhead costs, for example. All of that you can sort of do in-depth research on. But the bottom line is, you charge what you want to charge. You charge what clients are willing to pay for. But that's kind of what you can do. But what should you do is to kind of look at what your competitors are charging, and sort of place yourself in a place that makes you competitive, makes you appealing as a brand to purchase from. So if your price is like way higher than everybody else's price, funny thing is people actually might be willing to pay those prices, right? But for how long? If you're trying to build a sustainable business, you need to incorporate a pricing strategy from the start that is sustainable. So you don't want to be charging super high when you just start because, just because you can. And then when people start patronizing you, you now then, slash your prices all the way down to the bottom. It just doesn't look good from a kind of pricing consistency perspective.
I think that's key. I think in reference to pricing, I think a lot of people need to do their research first. I think you've touched on that. Basically, just doing your research, finding out what your competition is doing, and do your SWOT analysis, and then that should be able to guide you as to how you should price it. Okay, another question. It's a legal question. How can you protect a factory in Nigeria or any other place from copying your clothes exactly without any difference? I think you mentioned it earlier on in your session.
Okay, so protect your designs. So this is like from a fashion designer perspective, right? Okay, from copying with the factory, right? So first and foremost, it is your responsibility as a designer to take steps to ensure that your designs are not copied, right? There's certain things that you can and certain things that you literally cannot do. So for example, if somebody goes onto Instagram and takes your pictures and starts giving to other people, there's not a lot that you can do. You can shame them on Instagram or whatever, but unless you want to kind of take it up legally. But practical things that you can do is to have this open discussion with your factory or whoever is doing your production. And I actually preempt that discussion, I guess, because I'm a lawyer by background. I already know that is one of the issues. So when I ask a designer to send me some sketches or whatever images, I tell them in advance that, look, I know that even before you're going to send this, you're going to be worried about designs. You don't need to worry, right? Because I have a mandate. I made a commitment as a business not to engage in that sort of practice. So if you bring your designs to me as a factory, I'm not going to. So if somebody brings something to me off your Instagram page, I'm not going to agree to produce them. And people who have been talking with me know that I've said this. That's number one. Number two, I've also said that we have an agreement where in there is there's an IP clause in there around what we will do and not do. But having said that, caveat is I'm not going to appoint myself as the fashion designer police council. Do you know what I mean? So it is not my job to go and start. If I get a design, it's not my job to go and start looking around all the designers to see if somebody else has done this before, right? So if somebody goes and produces a sketch that looks original to me, I'm going to produce it. What I will not do is if they bring a picture to me that is clearly somebody else's work, I will not produce that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I have another legal question here, which is, if someone produces the design from sketch, she wants to understand, I think she just wants you to clarify. I think you mentioned something against it for you to be able to protect it. She says, from her understanding, you're saying it's not illegal if someone produces the design from her sketch. So let's say she's the originator, she sketched out a design and someone saw her sketch and reproduces it. Is that illegal or is that legal? Okay. That's from Tina Olagunju.
Okay, so I'm going to make the distinction. What I was distinguishing between there is two different types of intellectual property rights, right? Okay. So the sketch is protected by copyright because, like I said, copyright protects images, writings, drawings, and the like, right? So if you have a sketch, for example, and somebody goes and produces that sketch in City People magazine, your exact sketch, that is a copyright infringement. Does that make sense? Yes. Now, when you're talking about the design that is depicted in that sketch, that is a design rights issue.
Okay.
So for example, you have the sketch. So have the sketch or an illustration of this design. Somebody takes that takes the sketch and uses it somewhere else. They've infringed on your copyright. Somebody takes that same sketch and produces the design that is in there and makes a dress, right? You cannot copy that dress using copyright. You copy that dress using design rights.
Okay, that makes sense. Yes, it does. I hope it does. From the same person, she asked about fabric sourcing.
Okay.
For startups, do you suggest we buy in bulk to eliminate the unavailability of fabric when the need arises for like a ready-to-wear brand? I think what she's trying to say is that if they are buying in bulk, will they, if there's no available fabric, let me read the question out so it makes sense.
Yeah, about fabric
okay.
Startups, do you suggest we buy in bulk to eliminate unavailability? Well, what I would say about that is it's all about the money. It's all about the Benjamins, as they say, right? So can you afford as a business to buy? Because bear in mind that when you're buying in bulk, you're not only just buying one fabric, you're probably buying like across like, you know, different styles, well, so not styles, different colors, for example, different patterns, whatever. So do you have the capital? So A, do you have the capital to tie up in materials in your stockroom? Even if you had the capital, do you want to tie up that amount of capital in just fabric, right? So that's one. That's kind of a financial decision and a business decision to make. That's one. On the other hand, I think it's really important to be true to where you are as a brand, right? If you know that, you know, here's where we are, we cannot afford to be buying all this fabric and keeping where we actually don't know if we're going to need to produce from it or whatever. You can now then sort of adopt the approach that we only produce limited edition collections, right? We cannot guarantee that you see a style on our design or a pattern or whatever, and it'll be available once once the stock runs out. So available until stock runs out. As long as you're clear in your messaging and in your communication, I think it's fine. So if you say to people, look, you know, we have this in 20 pieces. Once it's gone, it's gone, you know, that's kind of it. If you want it in this, if you want this design, let us know. If we can source it in the same pattern, we will. If not, here are the alternative patterns that you can use. So it's just being transparent, and it's being kind of open and honest with your customers. Does that make sense?
Excellent. All right, fantastic. I've got another question here. Sorry. This is such an interesting topic. How would you advise on getting the right team together? Because I think you mentioned something about, obviously, with human capital and making sure that you have your structure in place, you have your business processes in place. So from your personal experiences, how would you advise on making sure you have the right team together to support your organization or your business or your fashion brand?
Okay, so a couple of things. One is, again, which is why it all boils down to structure. So you know how I mentioned earlier, if you identify all of the different processes or micro processes that are involved from end to end, as you identify all the steps involved, you also identify who the kinds of people are or what kind of skills, experience, and expertise level is required for each of those different functions, right? So that's kind of like, you know, from a technical perspective, you know, when you identify what you need to do, then you identify, okay, I probably need a procurement person here. I need somebody who's great at, you know, doing pattern making and a master cutter. I need like a head tailor, whatever. You identify what all your needs are. So that's the technical aspect. From the kind of, you know, I guess human aspects, you also need to identify what kind of team you want to build, right? So the kind of team I want to build personally is a team that loves to work here. So yesterday, for example, you know, I put something on Instagram where we had an order. I just got it late on Saturday evening. I had to have people come to the factory on Sunday. And I sent a message to my, you know, team WhatsApp group, hey guys, I need some of you to come to work on Sunday. And before I even got to the factory yesterday, some of them were already here. For me, that's evidence of people who feel invested in the company. And there are different ways that I've gone about doing that. So for example, I have team meetings every Friday, which is still a struggle because, you know, they don't like to talk, but I just encourage that. Tell them, you know, give them little snippets of where the company is going so that they can feel like they're actually part of something that's growing and they want to be here when it gets to where I've told them it's going to get to. Does that make sense? That, and then I have one-on-ones with my staff once a month because some of them don't like to talk in the team setting, but just again, you know, just always to have a pulse of how people are feeling, how they, you know, are there any issues so that you can deal with those things before they become a big problem.
Fantastic. At what point do you reckon a company or an organization should seek legal counsel? Should they consider getting a lawyer or getting some legal advice before they start their brand, or just about when they figure out whether they are a solopreneur or whether they are you know, or a limited organization or organization, at what point would you advise they get legal counsel for their brand?
Okay, so two things. One is, as a startup business, your focus is on saving cost. Totally get it, right? You don't want to spend money where you don't need to. Even I still do that either. I still don't want to spend money when I don't want to, when I don't need to spend money. So eyes on the money at all times. However, there's a saying of being penny wise, pound foolish.
Mm-hmm.
Save in small pennies now, you could potentially lose in big money if you don't have the right things in place. So whilst I wouldn't suggest that you go and get legal counsel or go to, you know, a massive legal firm or whatever, what I would recommend is as early as possible to get two things. One, legal advice, two, financial advice, right? So, and when I say those things, it doesn't have to be anything super grand. It doesn't have to be anything that you go and spend so much money on. You know, one of the great things about social media these days is you have a lot of people on Instagram. Again, be careful of that. Like, you know, go with people that have been recommended and, you know, and have been, you know, tried and tested. Do your own due diligence as well. But the point I'm trying to make is, as a, you know, this, so the entry, or like the barrier to entry has been lowered in terms of getting these sorts of pieces of advice. So now you have like different hubs that exist for SMEs, right? Where there's a keen understanding of the fact that money is an issue, and so they kind of aggregate advice and then sort of make it more affordable in that way. So I would get legal advice from the start in terms of how should I, you know, what should I set this business up as? Should I do it in this way? What kind of documentation do I want to have in place from the get-go? That's one. And then two, financial advice. How do I want to structure the business from a financial perspective? And then you can then start getting accounting advice of how do I document all my accounting processes and so on. Does that help?
Yes, it does. I have so many people raising their hands wanting to talk. If you have any questions, please do ask. We've literally got 5 more minutes left. I have three more questions to ask. I hope you have time, Abisade. I've got a list about 7 people putting their hands up, but I can only ask these questions here. So I have here, is it legal to import fabrics into Nigeria? Do you know anything about import taxes? And if so, can we deliver directly to your factory, somebody asks? And do you take on dead stock fabric?
Okay, so we take on, so do we take on dead stock to produce for other people or to kind of absorb as a factory?
Ooh, I think to absorb as a factory. If you can answer both, that would be great.
Okay, so we don't really, so I'm looking into sort of setting up or starting an own brand manufacturing sort of aspect of the business where we actually produce our own stuff, just basic utility apparel. But until that time comes, we only, so one of the strategies that that's part of the business model is we don't buy stock, right? So that's one of the areas where I'm able to kind of save costs. We don't just buy stock and keep, we you know, so we do contract manufacturing. We get orders, we produce, and we ship them out at the end, right? So in terms of dead stock, potentially, like, you know, it's worth, you know, yeah, get in touch. Let's see what it is that you have and what our needs are. And again, I don't only think of what my needs are now. I think ahead in terms of, okay, what I want to do in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. And if that fits into what we're doing, yeah, we can see.
Fantastic. And lastly, are you open for business now?
Yes, 100%. So we are open for business. In fact, we have an order at the moment. I'm going to run upstairs back to the factory now. Once I get off this call, we have an order to do some scrubs for a hospital. So yeah, so we've been doing face masks. We did 30,000 face masks for the Ogun State government. We've been doing, you know, but mostly PPE. Well, because of the strange times that we find ourselves in, mostly PPE stuff, because that's kind of, you know, what's needed in high volumes at this time. But yes, we are open for business. For designers, we're not really producing for designers at the moment because all our resources are kind of tied up doing a lot of the essential service stuff. But what we are doing from a designer perspective is we're having conversations, because I think that, you know, you don't just start producing today. You kind of understand what they want to produce, understand their business, understand what the constraints are, kind of, you know, start, you know, getting to know, knowing me, knowing you, as we say in Nigeria. So start sort of, you know, getting to know and understand each other and see if I'm the right factory for your fashion business, and, you know, and vice versa.
Thank you so much, Abisade. That's been so insightful. It's been knowledgeful. It's been impactful. Thank you so much. And we planned to have done this for 40 minutes to an hour, and I think we've achieved that. There's so much to take away from this. If you would like to share with everyone where they can find you, how they can find you, and to just give a little brief summary about what it is that you do and what your organization does before we close, and then I'll give a final remark.
Sure. So thank you so much. It's been, it's been a great conversation. I love to teach. I love to share the knowledge that I have. So I've really enjoyed this. Thank you for engaging, for your questions. Thank you to AFWL for having me, to Ronke and Buki for putting this all together. Much appreciated. I think I talked about heritage apparel at the outset, but in case people were not on, then I'll just talk about it very, very briefly. So we're a garment factory located in Abeokuta, Ogun State in Nigeria. We do 4 main things. One is mass production of things of basic utility apparel like uniforms and so on. 2 is we do retail manufacturing for designers who want to scale up into retail. 3 is we do adira production as well. And then we also are setting up a vocational training institute. This is more like a capacity building arm of what we do to really help to start to upskill the kind of tailoring level that we have in the country. So that's that. From a personal perspective, I'm also an academic, so I'm a lawyer, and I'm doing a PhD at the moment looking at the role of international law in the fashion industry. And as part of that, I'm actually releasing a book at the end of this month, June, talking about the impact of COVID on the fashion industry. So that's kind of what I'm busy doing at the moment. Yeah, that's
excellent. Me. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. We're really grateful that you took out the time to spend some time with us to go through the masterclass with Abisade, which is the business of fashion. Hope you all learned something from it. This masterclass series continues this Thursday, 1 p.m. with the Demarin twins, Lola and Lyle, who would be talking and discussing and teaching you on how to get the most out of your connections. We hope you join us then, and we'll be continuing the masterclass series throughout the month of June. Once again, thank you so much, and have a great afternoon. Thank you again, Abisade. Take care. Bye, everyone.